So as an example, I would like to take a paper which was published in 2018 in the journal Public Understanding of Science. And it's a very interesting paper because it looks at the case of Nigeria. It's co-authored by Bankole Falade and Martin Bauer. And it looks specifically at the interaction between science and religion in Nigeria in terms of attitudes to science. So if you remember, the received view of science communication is that it is meant to improve attitudes to science, to increase people positive attitudes to science. And one of the ideas which is always underneath that hope is that anything which competes with science will work against increasing positive attitudes to science. And one of the big foes of science in that view is religion. So the more people are religious, the more likely they are to have bad feelings about science, and the more likely they are to devalue science and not see it as a very important, as a very positive way of, and the more likely they are to not see science in a positive light. What this paper does is to demonstrate that this notion is wrong, at the very least in the case of Nigeria, but they mention gesture towards other studies which suggest that it's the same in other places as well. And they come up, or they evoke a concept which is interesting, which is concept of cognitive polyphagia, and which is the idea that people can have different kinds of knowledge and different ways of thinking coexisting in their heads without suffering from what has been called cognitive dissonance. So I think the main demonstration of that paper is encapsulated in this quote, which is page 32 of the paper, and which reads, "The scientific concepts are accommodated into common sense rather than simply displacing older ideas." So it's really the idea that science finds a place in people's ways of thinking, people's representations of the world, people's worldview, and do not replace these, but gets aggregated to them. And that is this aggregation which is interesting. The positivist ambition of old and new atheists, so think Richard Dawkins, for instance, a common sense cleansed of all religious content is unlikely to be borne out by empirical reality. So what does it mean is that the observations which emerge from this study and others show that science and religion are not in a conflict to shape people's worldview, but in fact they coexist and they collaborate to enable people to create these worldviews. And Falade and Bauer expand on this idea, and they say, in many societies, cognitive polyphagia, the diversity of forms of thought, is the rule, not the exception. And indeed, Shane and et al. Found the coexistence of high scientific enculturation and pseudoscientific beliefs and fortune-telling practices in Taiwan, in particular, among the educated younger generation. So you can see it's not only Nigeria, but in Taiwan, referring to Shane and et al. Study, there are also coexistence of high scientific knowledge and culturation, high scientific literacy, if you want, and people who are well educated in science. It doesn't prevent them from believing in pseudoscientific knowledge, for instance, fortune telling. So you see that this kind of study gives us a sense of what happens when science circulates in society. The idea is that scientific contents which circulate in society do not necessarily displace pre-existing conceptions or knowledge, such as those underpinned by religion. Instead, they get assimilated in the existing stock of shared knowledge to create some kind of synthesis, if you want. So in this study, there is they've looked specifically at how science and religion coexist in people's understanding of the world, in what they call common sense. And what they found, asking questions and mixing qualitative and quantitative data, is that religion is not what's in opposition to science, but in fact, science and religion interact with each other to the extent that the way in which people relate to knowledge is moderated by religion, as they put it. And to make it clearer, the more religious people are, doesn't mean that they are less likely to believe in knowledge, for instance. Okay, so people with very strong religiosity, whether they know little about science or they know a lot about science, will not significantly change their views about scientific progress. People with very weak religiosity, if they know little about science, will not have a very strong belief in the idea of progress, but if they know a lot about science, will have a strong belief in the notion of progress. And people who are in the middle, strongly religious, if they know little about science, they will have little belief in the idea of progress. If they have medium knowledge about science, they will have a high belief in the notion of progress. And if they know a lot about science, they will have little belief in the notion of progress. They've also asked people whether they fear science or not. What they found is that if people have weak religiosity, which is this line at the top, or very strong religiosity, which is this line here, their level of knowledge will not significantly modify their fear of science. It's quite constant. So you see that from this set of data, it comes that religion, far from undermining people's trust in science, if you want, or attitude to science, could be seen as upholding this attitude. And I think the more interesting aspect of this data is that what is transforming attitudes to science, so belief in progress and fear of science, is the level of knowledge people have of science. And so Faladay and Bauer have this quote: the two categories, strong and very strong religious, are polyphasic. So they have several forms of knowledge coexisting in their heads because they engage with both science and religion, however, with different consequences in relation to evaluative attitudes. The very strong are fearful, but also more optimistic. And in fact, science takes on the sacred qualities of shock and awe, which are attributes which come from religion. So basically, religion is prompting people to relate to science in a specific way, which and they transfer to science their way of relating to religion. While the more conventional believers are more realistic about science, they are less optimistic and less fearful. So once I'd like just to come back to this, to those graphs, which shows that people with, so that's the strong religiosity, it's what they call the conventional religious people. The more they know about science, the less fearful they are. And the more they know about science, the less optimistic they are about science. So that's, and the variation is about knowledge and not religion. So religion is what enables to understand how people situate themselves in relation to science differently. So this is the case of Nigeria. In the literature review for this article, the authors Bankole Falade and Martin Bauer pointed towards other studies which suggest that the same kind of coexistence of beliefs and knowledge exists in other parts of the world, in Taiwan, for instance. I mean, this news story about science, which appeared a few years ago, I think it was 2016 in the British daily newspaper, the Daily Express, which is a conservative tabloid, suggests that the same kind of situation prevails in Britain as well. So it's the story which is about a young boy, Ollie Carroll, who's suffering from a rare genetic condition, which is called Batten's disease, for which there is no known cure, so it's incurable. And the message of this story, I mean, the undertext of this story is that basically the prince performed some kind of miracle because that child who couldn't walk, upon seeing the prince, finds the strength to walk. And this is encapsulated in the quote from the mum, a pull-out quote. Ollie isn't actually aware of who Harry is, but just reacted instinctively to the way he was talking and interacting with him. So there is this idea that the royal person is projecting something which can make the paralytic walk. And this is something which goes back a long way. It's almost a medieval kind of belief that people with a royal status have some kind of aptitude to perform miracles and cure the ills and the paralytics. So you can see that in one piece of newspaper, you've got that mention of a rare genetic condition with no known cure. So it calls upon people pre-existing scientific knowledge, if you want, but at the same time it tells a story which is completely pseudoscientific and verges on the irrational, and the idea that really a royal person or somebody endowed with rural status can succeed where science couldn't. So you can see that when science circulates in society, there is, instead of displacing existing beliefs, existing knowledge, non-scientific knowledge, it will mix with those knowledges to create something else, a synthesis, if you want. So already we can see that the idea that knowledge is first developed in society, in the lab, and then transferred to society to educate people and increase their scientific literacy, and everybody starts believing that science is the only valid way of producing knowledge and the only valid source of knowledge. This view is a bit fragilized by those observations, and so we are moving closer to the STS view of science communication, which is the idea that scientific knowledge, scientific contents, when they circulate in society, mix and interact with other forms of knowledge and beliefs. And this is what science communication is. These different ways of understanding science communication, in fact, rest on different understandings of communication.